Colette, over to you.
Sorry. Thank you so much. So welcome everyone to the second, as Emma said, of our two EU election hustings that we are hosting. Again, this is an opportunity for the sector to engage directly with your MEP candidates, to hear what they have to say in relation to the sector and to ask some questions that are pertinent to yourselves. I'd like to thank each of the candidates for joining me today. Paul Gavin, the left in the European Parliament, GUE NGL Sinn Féin for the South constituency. We are hopefully going to be joined by Niamh Hourigan, Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, Labour and South. Billy Callagher, MEP, Renew Europe Group, Fianna Fáil, South. Grace O'Sullivan, MEP, Group of the Greens, European Free Alliance, Green, South. Cian Prenderville, the left in the European Parliament, GUE NGL, People Before Profit, South. And Lisa Chambers, Renew Europe Group, Fianna Fáil, Midlands North West. And we'll hand over to them soon. But first, just a brief background on this campaign and what's bringing us all here today. So this is part of our EU election campaign, which was officially launched a couple of weeks ago. It'll run parallel and with the same overall themes as our local elections under the banner of The Future is Community. It asks MEP candidates to sign up to a pledge in support of the sector, one which acknowledges both the huge contribution of the sector in terms of the services that organisations across the country are providing, but also recognition of the challenges experienced by the sector, the availability of funding and supports for core costs, to name just a couple. The pledge has four main themes based on values important to our sector. So courage to champion the causes of the community and voluntary sector at EU level, and for candidates to use their voices to speak up for civil society in Ireland and across Europe. Collaboration to support Irish charities, community groups and social enterprises at EU level through initiatives like an EU match funding scheme, ring fencing of decentralised funding and streamlining of application processes so that the EU is fairer and more accessible for everyone. Accountability to model participative dialogue processes in decision making and to work closely with groups at EU level that represent the sector, such as the Social Economy Expert Group, and to hold the EU to account in its implementation of its Social Economy Action Plan. And inclusivity, to work to build communities that are inclusive of all cultures and traditions and enable groups working in these areas to develop through access to European funds while embedding the SDGs in their overall approach. So we've ensured that all candidates today are aware of these priorities and have been invited to sign our pledge committing to these principles. And along with this campaign for both the local and European elections, we've also been actively engaging in the Ardèche. So in November last year, we attended the Sinn Féin Ardèche, we were at the Social Democrats Ardèche in February, the Labour conference in March, and the Fianna Gael Green Party and Aontú Ardèche in April. So we have been busy spreading the good news of the sector. At each event, we've spoken to the party leaders and to politicians and policymakers in areas of importance to the sector, and we'll continue to have follow-up meetings and engagement to advocate for the sector and engage on shaping election manifestos. We're also currently working on our pre-budget submission for Budget 2025. So we have listened to our members in town halls, in consultation events, and in responses to our members' policy survey and our regulation survey. So we're focusing on more of the things that matter to our members. We'll still be advocating for increased core funding, multi-annual funding, proportionate regulation, and greater recognition of the value of the sector as a delivery partner, particularly in the area of health and social care. But we're also going to be taking a sub-sectoral approach, so advocating in key social, economic and environmental areas that our members have told us matter most to them. So several of the priorities outlined in our pledge, so the establishment of an EU match funding scheme, ring fencing of certain funds, etc., that will also be echoed in that document. And we will have more on a launch date for that in the coming weeks. And we'll be running some pre-budget advocacy training as well in mid-June. So we'll continue to keep people updated about our activities in the run-up to the elections, our pledge, our pre-budget submission, and our ongoing engagement with MEPs once elected. And we look forward to working with successful candidates to facilitate that engagement So now we'd like to hand over the floor, I'm sure you're all sick of listening to me, to our candidates who've joined us today, and to give them each a chance to talk to the sector representatives that are here. And then just a reminder again, if you have any questions, please do pop them into the Q&A function, and we will pose them at the end of the candidate sessions. So to start, I'll hand over to Paul Gavin of the Left in the European Parliament, Sinn Féin South constituency. Paul.
Thank you very much, Colette. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to get straight into it. Firstly, just to introduce myself, Paul Gavin, in the Shannon for the last 8 years, where I have consistently spoken up for the community and voluntary sector. Before that, I was a SIPTU official, and I actually did work for the community sector there as well during those really harsh times in the early years of the second decade when there was horrendous cutbacks made to the sector. I was there representing organisations and members from a trade union point of view. So I want to state how important I believe the community and voluntary sector to be. I think everyone's going to say that, but I think I can point to my track record of having spoken up consistently in the Shannon in relation to issues like pay equity, particularly for Section 39 workers, and also actually helping to resolve long-standing issues like the one in relation to rehab and rehab staff in Limerick, where I was proud to stand with them until they got the resolution that they deserved. So social enterprises like charities, community groups, I know they're often run on a shoestring budget, and they find it difficult to avail of funding due to unnecessary red tape and bureaucracy. That administrative burden needs to be reduced in order to help nurture and grow social enterprises and expand the social economy. I want to talk to the 4 key asks that have been set out by the Wheel. But beforehand, just want to acknowledge the work of the Wheel. The resources, training and networking opportunities that you provide are absolutely essential and absolutely vital to the work of the sector overall. So firstly, championing the cause of community and voluntary sector. As I've said already, my background in championing workers' rights has included engaging with many charity and community organisations like the Irish Wheelchair Association and others who've campaigned for better pay for Section 39 workers. I think I must have raised that issue at least half a dozen times in the last couple of years alone. I've also engaged with trade unions for these workers, rehab workers, Kerry Parents and Friends Association. Community organisations cannot exist without their staff and the invaluable work that they do. Funding for those pay increases has still been too slow. And I'd reference the fact that the Irish Wheelchair Association in Cavan had to shut its doors a few weeks ago because not enough was done by the government to try and keep the staff. Chris McManus, the current Sinn Féin MEP, has always engaged with the Wheel at EU level, and he's asked me to send his apologies today. If I'm elected as an MEP, I'll continue that work and engagement with Chris at EU level. In terms of accountability and working towards a social economy, Sinn Féin voted in favour of the resolution on the EU action plan for the social economy, and we were particularly supportive of the proposal that member states should set up local social economy contact points with a view to raising awareness of and facilitating access to support and funding. As an Irish delegate to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, I have always engaged extensively in committees, and working towards a social Europe is something I've always advocated for. Crucially, I've called for the EU to accede to the European Social Charter, and that's a point that marks us out, I think, from most of the colleagues on the call today. A social Europe means protecting the rights of the most vulnerable in our society and guarantees rights in relation to employment, housing, health, education, social protection, and welfare, making sure that no one is left behind. And while all of the candidates are going to say that, of course, they support a social economy, what makes Sinn Féin stand out is opposition to the fiscal rules, which currently make a truly social economy impossible. Sinn Féin are different in Europe. We challenge the fiscal rules and the rules limiting state investments. There are parts of our society, like the community sector, where things cannot be left to the market. And that's a key point that I want to make this morning. In terms of engaging with national and local policy makers, we know that at a national level, the key issue around multi-annual funding is being ignored by the current government. Community groups and organisations need to have that funding secured for more than a year at a time so they can plan ahead, and it's something my party will continue to call for. As I mentioned already, another key issue for the sector is pay parity between sections 36, 56 and 59, and the likes of the HSE and private sector. A pay deal has been done, but work must continue to ensure full pay parity. So we need to see an increase in public funding to bridge the gap for community groups to allow them to pay the new living wage. I believe in a strong state working with community organisations, but fundamentally, my view of the EU is that it should be a social union looking after people and communities, not just an economic or trading bloc. And just as I'm probably reaching the end of my time to say, At the moment, the EU is moving further away from social rights. I think that's an important point to make. It's moving towards bigger spending on militarization, and that is not the direction that Sinn Féin believe that the European Union should be going in. We must have MEPs elected that will stand up for Ireland, stand up for workers and communities, and who will not support Ursula von der Leyen's candidacy and her moves towards a more militarized Europe and prioritizing free markets rather than social rights. I think I'll leave it at that, Colette, if that's all right.
That is perfect. You're about a minute under time, Paul. So well done, you. Thank you so much for that. I think we are just trying to allow Niamh in at the minute. So I might pass on to our next candidate if I can. So if I can ask Billy Kelleher, MEP of Renew Europe Group, Fianna Fáil South, if you can speak, and I will set my timer again for 5 minutes. Thank you, Billy.
Thank you very much, Colette, and thanks to the invitation to speak here today. Look, at the outset, I mean, we will all agree that stronger charities and stronger communities is something that we would all support. The question, of course, is how do you support and what policies do you put in place to underpin it? I suppose one of the challenges we always have from a European perspective is to ensure that, you know, we can relate our work and our decisions and our voting intentions and the policies we support and pursue in Europe to the point where they're relevant in people's lives in Ireland, and more importantly in communities as well. And that is a very difficult challenge at times to communicate that. But I do believe that, you know, when you look at where we are in Europe and what we're trying to achieve from the point of view of centrist policies, certainly the concept of just the free market on its own being the only way of addressing issues is something that, you know, I question very often. So, I mean, we do have a great debate in Europe over that. And I believe that the idea that we can just allow the market be the only way of addressing challenges is something that I don't subscribe to. And neither does my party, Fianna Fáil, subscribe to in terms of the policies it pursues. So when we talk about stronger communities, we have to ensure that there's supports in place. And of course, if we were to be very honest with ourselves, of course, the more that we put in from a state perspective into communities, well, then you should be hoping that there's less pressure on charities and the voluntary sector to actually have to step into that vacuum, which is created by the state's absence in certain areas. Unfortunately, the state very often hasn't the capacity or the reach and sometimes the political direction to address those particular issues. So the voluntary sector and the charity sector are key components of delivery of services in communities across the country. And from that point of view, you know, funding, both from a national perspective and a European perspective, should be channeled there. But I do think that there's a gap that has to be addressed, and that is that local government, in my view, is an area that needs to be bolstered to ensure that it can support and accommodate and cooperate with charities and with the voluntary sector at a community-based level. And I believe that at times that is a significant failing from the state's perspective to put in place proper channels of communication, but over that oversight as well, so that charities, the local organizations, local voluntary organizations, and then local authorities, that they can work on areas that are not receiving the support and the attention that they deserve. And that's an area that I think that could be addressed. It will also address an issue, so sometimes the duplication. In other words, you have charities out there doing exceptionally good work, but the duplication, the cost of duplication at times is an issue. But from my perspective, when I look at, you know, the various voluntary sectors, the charities, right across the entirety of the social economy, you know, the voluntary aspect is a critically important component in the entirety of that. So you take from credit unions right across to support for homeless agencies. There is a huge well of voluntary support there, and that has to be encouraged and nurtured. But it has to be done in a way where you have professional people, obviously, managing the charities, managing the supports that are required for the voluntary sector to do its work. From the Europeans' point of view, we certainly have to ensure that there's more security in terms of streams of funding, as was referenced by the previous speaker. Very often it's hand-to-mouth support. There's no strategic plan in place to ensure that charities and the social economy actually have a multi-annual funding stream so they can actually plan into the future. both not just in terms of personnel and training of personnel, but also in terms of the actual provision of the service itself. And very often we see from one accounting year to the next accounting year, a huge degree of uncertainty as to whether or not funding will be provided. And I just think we have to move away from that. If charities and voluntary organisations are providing an essential service, a support to a community, a support to sectors within the community, well, then we have to ensure that there is a multi-annual funding stream in place so they can actually plan into the future to deliver those services. And that would be a key area where I think Europe can play a role in. Just reference was made to the whole issue of the fiscal rules. I mean, very often we blame Europe for lots of things, but I mean, the significant issue around Ireland at the present time is we do not have a very strict oversight in terms of fiscal rules, because we're running a budget surplus and our GDP borrowing rates are going down. Now, that's not to say that the fiscal rules do put constraints on countries, but at the same time, from an Irish perspective, charities and other voluntary sectors that are funded by the state, won't be finding that they can't receive funding because of the fiscal rules that are placed on member states due to our budgetary strength at the moment. So while it's an issue that could cause difficulties in the future, at the here and now, where Ireland is positioned on budgetary matters, it should not have any negative impact on charities and the voluntary organisations in securing funding from government. So look, I want to wish you well. Thank you very much, and look forward to advocating for you on any issues that are important to you and collectively to the wheel as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Billy. I think you borrowed slightly from Paul's time, but we let you win it. It wasn't too bad. So thank you very, very much. We are now joined by Niamh Forrigan. Thank you, Niamh. Niamh is running for the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, Labour, and in the South constituency. Thank you, Niamh.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me as a participant in the debate. So just a little bit of background on myself first. So I'm a sociologist with 25 years of experience in higher education. I've actually worked with a lot of organisations that are linked to the wheel and the sector more generally, particularly organisations focusing on traveller mid care issues, housing, particularly Threshold, Cork Simon, Barnardo's, etc. I spent a number of years as co-chair of the Limerick Food Partnership, and that was an umbrella organisation which was seeking to bring all the frontline organisations dealing with food poverty in Limerick together, I suppose, to address precisely the kind of frontline issues that many organisations are facing around staffing, around infrastructure, etc. I suppose one of the things that it's really important to highlight, and I think it doesn't come across often in European debates, is that just like the Dáil, your grouping really matters in the European Parliament. It has a very significant impact on your capacity to deliver change. And at the moment, the second biggest group in the European Parliament, and the group that's probably most proactive in fighting to protect social funding, is the Socialists and Democrats. At the moment, Labour is the only party aligned to the Socialists and Democrats. And because we have no Labour MEP in Ireland, we have no link and we have no voice in that group, which is a very significant loss to Irish society more generally, but I think particularly to the community and voluntary sector. I think it's impossible to kind of underestimate the role that the S&Ds played, particularly in a kind of post-banking crisis Europe, in protecting the social. And in that sense, in many ways, it lines up with my own, I suppose, background and work, which I did particularly after the banking crisis, which was to fight the idea that Ireland is simply an economy and that we should be driven entirely by economic goals and objectives. Because despite the affluence that we have right now and the surpluses that we have right now, we have seen the community and the voluntary sector starved of resources. I mean, Labour put in a private member's motion in 2022 to have that critical link between workers in the voluntary community sector and workers in the HSC. And because, even though that motion was passed, because that has not happened, we are seeing, and I have family members of my own who work in this sector, we are seeing hemorrhaging of staff coming out of that sector. And they are staff who are at the front line of dealing with the most vulnerable in our society. And this is shocking, and I don't think we can stand over it as a society. And I think it's critical going into the next European Parliament that we not only highlight the importance of that at national level, but also defend and protect and fight for more social spending. I was interested in the comments that both Paul and Billy made about the fiscal rules. One of the big dangers in the incoming set of fiscal rules is that social spending and green spending will be pitted against each other within a broader framework that's really quite austerity focused. And we really need to fight that. That's so regressive. I mean, that we would have. And I suppose the final thing I think it's very important to say is that the housing crisis in particular, I think, has placed so much pressure, not only in workers and the voluntary and community sector, but also on the cohorts that they're dealing with. I mean, a lot of my own work, I worked for years in kind of the probation space, and the work in probation has become almost impossible because of the housing crisis, because of the difficulty of finding housing for people who are coming out of the prison system. And we really need to make Europe part of the solution to our housing crisis and not part of the problem. In the 1950s and 60s, the CAP was developed because it was recognised that food is a basic need. We need to protect food security. The EU has stood by and let speculators ravage the housing market in the entire European Union, while housing is a basic need, shelter is a basic need. And we need to have representation in European Parliament whose fight, it's not an investment, it's not a commodity, it's a basic need. And that is a critical piece as well in supporting the community and voluntary sector. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much for that, Niamh. Thank you. And now moving on to Grace O'Sullivan, MEP, Group of the Greens, European Free Alliance, Green South Constituency. Grace, thank you.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from Kilkenny, and it's great to be here with the Wheel, who were always very supportive, I found, when I got into politics in 2014. The area, just a little bit background myself. I was elected to the Seanad in 2016 and then the European Parliament 2019. I'm from Tramore, County Waterford, a mother, but also I'm a volunteer coach, surf coach, every Sunday morning in Tramore. So it's something that I've always taken great pride in, working, volunteering, and offering my services where I could within the community, as my three girls were growing up. So I believe, like in Ireland particularly, the community voluntary and charities, NGOs, like the work is so vital to who we are, to, as you said, Colette, in the outset, the values of what we hold. And I think we need to guard those values dearly. I suppose it's important to mention just the scope of the areas where the community, charity, and the sector covers. Like, you think of the sports. So in Ireland, we are very vibrant in terms of sporting, in health, well-being, fighting poverty, economic disadvantage, advocating for rights. And that's just a few of the areas. And I would like to think that I have, in my time as being a public representative, done everything I can to work with the sector to advocate on behalf of those that need the support. And we have seen like a backlash in recent times. Not only we're seeing it here in Ireland, but across Europe and globally. And this is something that we have to be conscious and aware of, but we also have to be proactive. What can we do to avert this backlash? According to the charities regulator, the overall financial impact of the charity sector was estimated at 32.1 billion in 2021. And people are the voluntary, those who are volunteering, and those are all the members of our families and community in that, but it's worth about 1 to 2.5 billion of working hours every year. So it's a massive contribution. And I think that that, you know, when I'm going out and I'm meeting the men's sheds, the women's sheds, the different communities, like I'm hearing, you know, of the importance in terms of Mehel and Lakela. And I think that's who we are. And as I said, that's something we have to guard. So I'm happy to say I signed the pledge, the wheel pledge, and without a doubt. But the core values, Colette, as you pointed out there, having the courage to speak up for civil society is important, but it's going to be more important as we go forward. In terms of the European Parliament over the last 5 years, we had a directive on the European Cross-Border Association, and that was a directive that was driven by the Greens rapporteur, a colleague of mine, Sergey, and it's on a statute for European cross-border associations and non-profit organisations. So that was adopted in 2022. So it picks up on numerous and long-standing calls from civil society dating back to many years to give associations in Europe a legal and EU-wide protection, and defending civil society organisations as key campaign platform for me as we go into this into the next mandate, if I'm lucky enough to be elected. And then on a personal level, I sat in the court with Sean Binder, who is a search and rescue humanitarian worker from Kerry, and he was down in the Mediterranean Sea trying to protect people who were crossing the Mediterranean seeking refuge, and he himself was charged with criminal activities. So I went into the court with him, stood with him, with his family, and the other members of the search and rescue organisation to help them out. So I think that being with people, bearing witness as an MEP does carry weight, and it did help him. It's still ongoing, but nevertheless, I will stand by people like Sean in terms of search and rescue. I was at sea myself for 10 years. I know what it's like to come across people whose lives are being threatened in storms and that. So I'll continue to do that. The second is the collaboration. And if I'm re-elected, I pledge to continue to have my door open to build a more collaborative and social Europe. And third element, accountability, and I know I'm running out of time. The next iteration of the Parliament, the European Expert Group on Social Economy and EU Social Economy Action Plan to build a more social Europe, as Paul was talking about. That's what we would be 100% behind. In terms of GDP and beyond GDP, and recognising that we're in a race to the bottom at the moment, I got legislation over the line in the Parliament that the first time ever in EU legislation that EU would move beyond GDP towards a more well-being economy, and recognising people and planet first. And then finally, in terms of inclusivity, you know, the whole cornerstone of the EU is integration and the promise of that social inclusivity and a strong economic Europe. So again, I would fight to defend that. And then I'm on the alliance of the SDGs. So yeah, so I would continue to work on that. Very equality, equity, fairness would be cornerstones for me. So look, that's just a kind of a quick introduction, and I look forward to the questions, and I definitely look forward to working towards whatever capacity possible, a more social and green Europe that recognises the challenges of climate change and biodiversity decline.
Thank you very, very much, Grace. Thank you so much for that. We now turn to Cian Prendeville, the Left in the European Parliament, GUE NGL, People Before Profit, South Constituency. Cian.
Thanks a million. Thanks for having me. So a little bit about myself. I'm based in Limerick. I was elected to Limerick Council in 2014 on the back of anti-austerity campaigning, anti-bank bailout campaigning at that stage. And now I'm running with People for Profit for the European elections, and I'm glad to be here and talking to yourselves. I think that as a socialist, I think my agenda will align in a lot of areas with the key things you're saying. I've signed the pledge and I support the immediate demands. But I also think, look, I have conflicted feelings on some of this stuff because, in one hand, I think the amazing work done in the community and voluntary sector is it's beautiful to see. It's amazing. It should be supported. But on the other hand, I think it is a sign of the failure of the state and a failure of the government that this has to happen. So my mother was previously a volunteer with the Rape Crisis Centre here in Limerick. She helped found the Carry Children at Risk in Ireland, the Limerick branch of it, and worked there for a number of years as their clinical director. And I saw in that work, one, the amazing work done by the charity sector, far better level of quality of service than TUSLA or their precursors were providing. But also I saw that partly the reliance on those charities was partly a cost-saving measure by the government. That like by outsourcing responsibility to charities, they were getting people working, being paid 20 hours, working 40 hours, and even the 20 hours they're being paid are less than than what you'd be paid if you were working for the HSE or TUSLA doing the same work. So, and I think a part of this is that everywhere where there's a reliance on charities to provide and volunteers to provide these services, it's amazing to see people step up to the mark and do that. But it's also a reflection of the failure of the state and the failure of the government to provide these services directly. That charity now is one that's had a 50% cut in their income and is facing potential collapse. It's one of the many like short-term contracts that you see. So yeah, so a couple of things there for where I strongly align. I agree fully with the fight for pay parity. I think that is a must. The fight for job security and for long-term funding, yeah, for sure. I think the EU matching funding proposal is a no-brainer. Like it's obviously that's not controlled by the European Parliament. That's a question for the Irish government to say that when charities are applying or community voluntary groups are applying for funding from the EU, that the state should match that funding in order to assist them in applying for that. That's an obvious thing. And I also think in the recent years we have seen the value of community works, community groups, the community voluntary sector in COVID in terms of like the Meals on Wheels services, the community, the work that was being done there was crucial. But also in the last couple of years with the threat, the rise of the far right, the rise of racism and hatred in this country, I think we've seen where there are community and voluntary groups embedded in these communities that are respected activists and parts of those communities, that they've been able to play a key role in debunking some of the myths and the lies that are spread, but also in channeling the fears that understandable fears people have, but channeling them in a positive direction, bringing communities together to welcome new arrivals and cut across the hatred that's being spread. So I think we've seen the importance of that, but part of the problem is that sector has been devastated by cuts in the last 15 years ago through the austerity years, and therefore we don't have the same level of on-the-ground community workers. So that's a couple of the key points. Other point in terms of I think that the VAT compensation scheme, lifting the cap there and lifting the minimum or scrapping the minimum donations for tax relief, I think are also straightforward. I don't see why the government should be seeing charities as a cash cow for taxation. I don't see why charities and community groups should be having to chip in on that. Then the final thing that I'd say is, look, as a socialist, I think that if you're engineering think that things are going broadly in the right direction, that I'm probably not the candidate for you. But if you think that actually, if you're alarmed by the direction things are going, by the fact that there are fiscal rules that control how much states can spend on housing, but no fiscal rules that control how much states can spend on weapons. That actually, despite all the fine words and the talk about supporting communities, the last 15 years have seen our communities devastated, homelessness and housing crisis being manufactured by restricting public housing. Like, if we were to really address the crisis in our communities, I think we need a fundamental change in direction. And I'd be hopeful that this European election can be sending that message and be a stepping stone towards that kind of bigger picture change.
Thank you very, very much, Cian. And now we go to our final speaker, to Lisa Chambers, Renew Europe Group, Fianna Fáil, Midlands Northwest constituency. Lisa.
Thank you, Colette, and hello everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today and to take part in the hustings. It's really appreciated. Just a little bit of an intro to myself. I'm currently a Fianna Fáil senator, the leader of Shannon Éireann, and a former TD for Mayo. I'm in elected politics now for the last decade, for 10 years, and have spent most of that time working on European briefs for Fianna Fáil. I'm a barrister by profession, legally trained in European Union law, and a member of the EU Oireachtas EU Affairs Committee. So that's just my, I suppose, a little bit of my own background. I'm from County Mayo, and I think anybody working in public life would have strong connections to the community and voluntary sector. It's kind of often where you start or what gets you politically activated. And then you spend a lot of time working with those groups and organisations in your own constituency. So for my own part, I work very closely with Mayo Rape Crisis Centre, Cancer Fund for Children. We're delivering a new respite centre into Cong in County Mayo that will service the Republic, and Meals on Wheels and Mayoras Common Hospice. So lots of fantastic organisations in Western Care that do amazing work. And I think that the community and voluntary sector, you know, you are the heart and the compassion of Ireland. And I dread to think what kind of a country we would have if those people didn't exist in terms of the community and voluntary sector and the work that gets done. I suppose in terms of work at a European Parliament level and what can we do to support the sector, I do think there's a job of work to do. I'm not sure which previous speaker touched upon this, but I suppose, why is there a need for so many services to assist people in different areas? And there are some imbalances and disparities across the country and inequalities that we do need to address in terms of our society. You know, this is a very diverse constituency, Midlands Northwest, and as somebody living in the west of Ireland, you know, we've got many islands as well off our west coast. Then you've got your border and Midlands region and your commuter belt. So there's lots of similar issues that I suppose connect us, but also going across to different parts of the country, there are unique issues to different areas. As somebody from a rural community and from rural Ireland, I think very often that's a really clear evidence of where you'll see community and voluntary sector really kick into action, looking after local communities in rural areas. And, you know, I suppose in contrast to the previous speaker, I think local communities are thriving and doing amazing work. And Mehel is very much alive and well in those communities. And there's a lot of positivity out there. And I think sometimes we tend to focus too much on the negative and not speak about the positive work that's happening and the really positive and good stories in communities across the core. In terms of the issues that you're focusing on for this election from the wheel and the big asks that you have of European candidates, I do want to acknowledge the huge contribution that the community and voluntary sector make to Ireland and our society. I do think there needs to be better funding supports in place in terms of your core costs. I know, you know, even just utility bills and keeping the show on the road, keeping the lights on is a big challenge. I do think there needs to be, I suppose, ring-fenced funding for the community and voluntary sector, and there needs to be multi-annual funding. It's very difficult to plan medium and long term if you're just going year to year and you have no consistency or certainty in terms of your funding. And that's always a big challenge. And then the heavy reliance that you have on fundraising. And as we saw during the COVID period, that became extremely challenging to bring in those funds that you would have become reliant on coming in every year. So that's a big challenge. No matter how big or small your organisation is, fundraising is always a core part of it. And you can't rely on that coming in at the same level every year. I do think in terms of you know, access to funding at an EU level, that is where your MEPs will come into play. So, you know, having, I think, experienced MEPs that know how the community and voluntary sector work, that know how national government works, and know how to link that in then with the work of the European Parliament. I think that's absolutely vital, because certainly what I've heard on the campaign trail is that people feel that there's a disconnect with some of their MEPs, that they don't see or hear from them for most of the 5-year term until election time. So having that connection back on the ground, working on the ground, and having, I suppose, the experience in terms of the Oireachtas and being able to link that back in with your work as an MEP, I think is crucially important, because that's how you deliver and actually deliver projects and funding. So knowing where to look for that funding at an EU level, knowing where the opportunities are, but then how do you get that back on the ground here and deliver that? So I just want to say that I completely support the pledge. I support the work that you do. If elected as an MEP to represent Midlands Northwest constituency, I will absolutely work with the wheel and all of the organisations that you represent to deliver better for the community and voluntary sector, to advocate on your behalf, to represent your views at a European Parliament level, and to try and deliver on the key asks that you have in your manifesto and as part of this campaign. And just to finish by saying thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be here. And I can see just from the Q&A that there's a few questions coming in. So I'm more than happy, looking forward to engaging on the questions and answering as best I can. Thank you, Colette.
Thank you very, very much. With 6 seconds to spare, Lisa. So thank you to all of our candidates. They've set out their stall for the sector really quite comprehensively. So now I'm going to hand over to Emma, who is going to moderate the Q&A session. So we have been looking through the questions and we've been grouping them, as we said, so that we can put them to the candidates in as comprehensive a way as we possibly can. So Emma, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Colette. I will attempt to try and wrangle all of these together, and Colette will be working in the background to keep grouping them together for me. So just asking candidates to please use the little raise hand function at the bottom of your screen there if you would like to respond to the question, and whoever raises their hands first, I'll be able to see it and I'll just get round to everybody then. So we will try and keep it as succinct as possible in your answers, please. I might have to be a little bit strict and cut people off just to give everybody a fair chance at answering. So the first questions that I will ask there's a couple of them. One is from Stephen O'Rourke, who's an independent candidate, MEP candidate. So he talks about how do you propose we move beyond this the more divisive political rhetoric that we're seeing at the moment and foster a more cooperative political environment that prioritises the needs of all. And we've grouped that together with another question that came in around how Ireland has been adopting some alarming anti-migrant rhetoric lately. What are the candidates' thoughts on this, and what would you do if elected to improve the conditions for migrants and refugees and to tackle anti-immigrant sentiment? So 2 questions there. Let me just open my thing here and I should be able to see who put their hands up first. So Paul, over to you first.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, I was fascinated by Stephen's question. I think we're going to have to disagree on this one, Stephen, because, I mean, just to quote yourself, you ask, how can you foster more cooperative political environment that prioritizes the needs of all? Now, the truth is you can't do that. The truth is you have to make choices, political choices. That's the reality. And that's why this European election is so important, because you have candidates coming from the broad left or the broad right. And right now, the European Union is heading in the wrong direction. It's heading towards a more centralized Europe, a more militarized Europe. Both the EPP and Renew support that move towards additional expenditure on militarization. And the truth of the matter is you can't have it all. You've got to make fundamental choices. And that's why I think it's really important in this election that people vote for the progressive left, because the progressive left aligns with that social Europe, with the values of the community and voluntary sector in particular. It's interesting to note, by way of example, that while everyone apparently now agrees on multi-annual funding, all of your members will know that we don't have it and that the government has made no moves towards it over the last decade. I also want to, just as an example, so we're not going to be able to agree on stuff. That's why we have elections. I'm proud to stand with the left and to stand with the idea of a social Europe and making choices that put people, workers, and communities first, not huge corporations, and certainly not the militarization agenda. The immigration question is a really important one. There has been horrendous rhetoric exercise in relation to this. My position is very clear. Everyone should be welcome in Ireland. We obviously have an immigration system that we have to operate. My issue is it's not funded properly. It hasn't been. I mean, we saw the headline yesterday, 21,000 people still waiting for an initial determination. So there's a lack of resources there, and I think we need to adopt that. There's also a big debate, and rightly so, about the EU Migration Pact. And again, I have a clear view on this. Sinn Féin is against the EU Migration Pact for the large part. And the reason we're against most of it is because human rights organizations have been really clear on this. It's going to result in a whole host of detention centers on the outskirts of Europe for men, women, and children. And I just think we could do better than that. I'm a member of the Refugee and the Committee and the Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe. I've heard from these organizations firsthand, human rights organizations, who tell us that the EU Migration Pact, let's be clear about it, this is a pact determined to keep people out of Europe. I think we need to do better than that. So I'm against that pact. We need to stand up for human rights, and we need to insist that immigration systems are fairly funded so we can always give a human rights response and thereby avoid the horrible divisive politics we have at the minute, where immigrants are being abused as somehow responsible for the crises that actually belong clearly with failures of government for too long now. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Lisa, you're next on my screen.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks to Stephen and I think the other person. I didn't get their name. I don't know if it's attached to their question, but look, I don't think Irish politics is as divisive as sometimes it's made out to me. Yes, we have disagreements. We don't have the same ideas on how to solve the challenges that we face, and they are shared challenges. But I think we're still a fairly middle ground, centrist political system, thankfully. Now, there are, you'll hear, I suppose, commentary suggesting that we've got hard left and hard right. I'm not buying into that completely. I do think there are some hardening of rhetoric and some hardened voices on certain issues. But for the most part, as somebody, I've been in the Oireachtas now for nearly a decade. I can tell you that maybe we go out at times and we debate each other and we robustly disagree with one another. And sometimes people don't, they play the person instead of the ball, and we often say play the ball, not the woman. But for the most part, when we're working together in that work environment, and it is a workplace, we get on very well. There's a lot of mutual respect for one another. We're all in the job usually for the same reasons, for the right reasons, because we want to serve our communities, we want to make a difference, we want to make an impact, and we want to make Ireland the best it can be. And even though we've got different views as to how to achieve that, for the most part, our politics is still very respectful, and the discourse is quite respectful, and we are good to one another, and we treat each other well. Not saying it happens all of the time, but sometimes those instances are amplified beyond their significance, is maybe how I might say that. And I do think we need to work together on shared challenges, but that doesn't mean you can't have a different approach as to how to address something. In terms of the issue in terms of immigration, look, in this particular campaign, it is coming up a lot. It is certainly, I would say, one of the top 3 issues coming up on the doors and when we're canvassing businesses. And, it's human nature to be afraid of change. That's, we don't, as people, as humans, we inherently don't like change. We get nervous about it because you get comfortable with what you know, but nothing stands still, nothing stays static forever, and things evolve and move. And I do think for the most part, there is a humanitarian approach to migration. People do want people treated coming in with dignity and with respect, and a humane way. But at the same time, we do need to have some structure on how we deal with this challenge, because the numbers coming into Ireland and other countries are far greater than we would have foreseen or anticipated. So that's just putting pressure on things like housing and public services, and that is coming up for politicians on the doorsteps. I would disagree with Paul on the EU Migration Pact. I think, it took 10 years to negotiate at an EU level, and to get agreement on that was hugely challenging. So to get that over the line and get agreement on it, that was a big deal. And that took a lot of negotiation and working with member states to address concerns. And I think you hear some people saying, that it's not, it's not human rights focused enough, or it's too hardened. And other people saying it's not hard enough. And sometimes when you've angered kind of both sides or both extremes, you've landed somewhere in the middle. You've probably got it mostly right. I'm not saying it's all right, but there is no perfect solution to this. But there does need to be some structure. And I do believe, from an Irish perspective, we are better working with other member states as, I suppose, in a team approach to this, because we're part of the club, we're part of the European Union. And I don't think it's an area where we should be going it alone. I think that would be a bad move for Ireland. So thanks for both questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Cian, you're next.
Yeah. Where you've annoyed both sides, you're doing something right. I disagree. Where you've annoyed the human rights organizations on the one hand, and you've annoyed the far right on the other hand, like I think I am happy to annoy the far right, the people that want 30,000 people drowning in the Mediterranean, people that think that there should be more. I'll annoy them. But I will side 110% with the human rights organizations that are saying that no, children should not be in detention centres, banned from attending school. And they are Trumpian policies that we are now seeing from the EU, and that is alarming. I think it's a disgrace that 30,000 people died, that, as Grace mentioned, that when Irish people volunteer to try to rescue drowning people from the Mediterranean, they face criminal charges for doing that. That is disgraceful, and I will not stay neutral on that injustice. On the bigger point, look, why is there polarization? I think there is polarization. I think it is a conscious decision from the establishment parties over the last 7-8 years to try to stoke this up. You go back 8 years, 10 years ago, we had a fairly united workers' movement, left on the march, on the rise, ordinary people rising up against austerity. and then the political establishment was in the retreat, and they had difficulty to try to justify their position. And then people like Leo Varadkar decided to start dividing and ruling, to start saying, oh, well, the problems, it's not caused by the bankers and the developers. The problems are caused by people who don't get up early in the morning, or by public sector workers being paid so much more than private sector workers, or by lazy, unemployed people. Those sort of divide and rule policies were injected. It is the injection of US-style politics into Ireland, but I disagree that it's an attempt to divide people. And I think they've succeeded, unfortunately, in trying to say that, oh, the cause of the problem is immigrants, or the cause of the problem is trans people, and this sort of hate rhetoric that has grown seeds here, and it needs to be pushed down. But we should also not deny that there is a problem. In the last 10 years, since the end of austerity, the Irish economy has doubled. The wealth in Ireland has doubled, but that is not seen in working class communities. All of that extra wealth, like in the last 10 years, of every €100 produced on an international level, only 50 cents of it has gone to the poorest 50% of the population. So we've had massive growth, but it's going lining the pockets of the rich, and we can't stay neutral to that injustice. We need to speak out against that injustice. People are right to be angry. People are right to be very annoyed at the housing crisis, which has seen rents double, housing prices double, homelessness go through the roof. But what we need to be doing is at the left, I think, needs to be pointing the finger of blame where it truly lies. With Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour and the Greens, who decided to slash public house building, who decided to lift the eviction ban, and decided to impoverish our local services. So we need to be building that kind of, and I think in that is bringing people together. When it was the water charges movement, I know some people may disagree, but in the water charges movement, I saw massive solidarity being built. Irish and migrants standing together, refusing to pay. And I think that, if we see a mass movement in Ireland for housing, I think that's something that we need. We need the trade union movement, Sinn Féin and the left to back building mass people power movements to fight for housing, to kick out the vulture funds, to demand rent controls and building public housing. That's what we need, and I think that can cut across. When the left is on the streets, unifying people in opposition to the real enemies, which is the 1%, the billionaires who are really benefiting for the last 10 years. That's I think how we can cut across that division. But I think we have to, we can't stay neutral to the injustices that are taking place either.
Okay, thank you, Cian. Next, I have Billy. Oh, you're on mute at the moment, Billy.
Yes, on the 2 points, I suppose they're interlinked and quite truthful. I mean, polarization is part and parcel of the very sort of rough, coarse debate that we now see in Irish politics and across Western world politics as well. I mean, you do go from the extreme left to the far right, and when you go to the extremes on both, well, I find that the debate really descends to a point where it is very coarse and doesn't reflect from the point of view of accepting the democratic wishes of the parliaments that primarily are elected at elections. So, I mean, you can't have a situation where if it's the left are protesting, well, that's fine. And if the right are protesting, well, that's bad. I mean, people are entitled to protest. I sit firmly in the left or in the centre, and the left and the right very clearly don't accept the policies that I pursue. And more often than not, even when there is a decision by people, either at local government level, European level, or national level more particularly, well, they still don't accept the outcome of those elections. So that is a very serious point. And it's something that we just have to debate as a society, both in Ireland and across Europe as well. We have elections, political parties put themselves forward. They are either elected or rejected. And very often those that are rejected will still not accept the mandate given to the governing parties. And that undermines the principle of democracy, and that is something that is difficult to explain because it is now the right that have taken on the mantle of a very aggressive protesting to the point where they're undermining the ability of politicians to go about their business and society to go about its business. But I mean, the left are no angels in this either. Let's be honest, particularly the extreme left. On the issue of the Migration Pact, look, I supported the Migration and Asylum Pact. And the reason I did is because I believe it is a move in the right direction. I wish we could do more, but it was very difficult to get agreement. The Parliament had been calling for Migration and Asylum Pact for some time, but the member states as individuals were delaying it at council level. But I have to take issue, and I don't want to create a divisive debate on this particular symposium, but we can't have two views from the one party. We simply can't, Paul. And that's why I believe the migration issue, we have to be all very sensitive and understanding that this is a very politically sensitive issue. It's now spilled out onto the streets in terms of protest. We see a very aggressive far right taking this issue on. But I mean, Sinn Féin has said it's against open borders. Like, we don't have open borders, Paul, because if we had open borders, we wouldn't have tens of thousands of people drowning in the Mediterranean over the last number of years to come to Europe. Because if they had open borders, they could simply get on a ferry and come to Europe. But they don't. They have to be smuggled into Europe. They have to come into Europe in ways other than presenting themselves at a port or at an airport. So we don't have open borders. What we have is porous borders. And when people come to Europe, yes, they are detained, but very often they're detained in the most awful, appalling conditions, as we've seen in Lampedusa and also in the Aegean Greek islands as well, and elsewhere across Europe. And I think the Migration and Asylum Pact will at least put some obligations on member states to have uniformity across Europe, number one, in terms of processing, and number two, that there would be certain oversight mechanisms in place to obligate member states to have proper facilities available for those that are being detained in the event of they coming in and they being assessed as potential risk, or coming in illegally, not presenting documentation, and others, could be processed in a timely manner. So if you look at the Migration Pact, there is a couple of obligations on states. One is a quick processing time for people who could be seen to be a risk to the European Union from a security perspective, not cooperating with the investigation, the processing. And then there's other obligations on migrants and those applying for asylum in the normal way. The UN High Commission for Refugees has supported the Migration and Asylum Pact. So not every organization is against it. Not every organization is against it. But I have to go back to the original idea that when we start playing politics with migration, we very quickly descend to a place that is not good for anybody, and particularly for the migrants themselves. And I'll accept my portion of blame from the point of view of the government and the need to ensure there's quicker resources and more resources put in place, but for the Immigration Department and the Justice Department itself. But please don't be coming on saying that you're against open borders and then saying with the same breath, well, you want all migrants to come in and to be housed and to have the fastest processing systems in place, when at the same time you're saying on the street that you don't want them in the first place. That is a dichotomy that undermines credibility, and it undermines the debate that we need to have in society about a fair, firm, but humanitarian approach to migration and asylum.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Billy. Paul, I see that your hand is up again. We're going to give everybody one chance to respond to each question, but you can address any points when you answer the next question if you like. So I'm handing over to Grace, who's next on my screen now anyway. Oh, Grace, I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Thanks very much. In terms of polarization, and I think the next European Parliament mandate, the 5 years coming up, will be crucial in terms of communication and the role of social media in terms of disinformation and misinformation, because the views have become so polarized, and it is creating anger and frustration, and we're now seeing almost like an attack on democracy, whereby politicians putting up the posters are being attacked because they're seen to be on a certain to have a certain view, and those who wish their view isn't heard, that they're going for physical attack. I was at a public meeting just during the week down in Dungarvan in County Waterford, and we had someone come into the meeting quite vicious and aggressive. It didn't stay too long, luckily, but again, disruptive. So I think we need to look at how we're communicating in relation to the let's say the sources and the tools that are being used, and how they're being used, abused, misused, whatever, and that we have to legislate and enforce pressures on the very companies, so the large social media corporations that are actually fueling the polarization. In terms of migration and asylum pact, so it's very interesting for me to hear the different views around the table this morning, because we in the Green Group, when it came to voting for or against the different elements of the pact, so there was 8 pieces of legislation, 2 annexes, and we voted for 2 pieces of the legislation, which was looking at the humanitarian resettlement, that things would be done in a fair and responsible way. And then we also looked at reception centres, again, that there would be a fair approach. What we were opposed to was this notion of a fortified Europe, that we would be no more than what Trump wanted between the Mexican and the US border, that we would, parts of this legislation would indicate that, you know, and suggest that we would be putting a fence around the southern borders. So the areas of access, the European Union would have surveillance, and that there would be fingerprinting of minors and others, but also of minors. So we had in the Green Group, real genuine concerns about the Asylum and Migration Pact. Now, it has passed, and there's a period of 2 years before the legislation would be transposed and implemented. So there is time still, from a national perspective, that we look at our situation in Ireland, because we're not a member of the Schengen countries. So on that basis, we're different than other European member states. So there are those differentiation points. We have to look from a national perspective in our country, how we can best cope with the situation of migration. But the one thing I want to bring up, and no one's mentioned, is why is this happening? So we know, for instance, there's areas of persecution, conflict, but we also know the climate is changing. And we know global warming is happening at a pace and scale and accelerating like we never anticipated. And this is putting enormous pressures on what I often call is the belt around the equator. So we know, because of climate change, people are being displaced, and they're having to move. They don't have the water, they don't have the drought, the living conditions are no longer sustainable. So we better get ready, you know, and I genuinely believe we have to have, obviously, a very fair approach, but it has to be within, you know, what we can offer. I mean, there's no point in us thinking we can do more. So we have to have a practical, pragmatic, but a very fair approach. But we've got to open up and our minds, and our the leaders of this country, the leaders, all of our councillors, those who will represent us in the European Parliament. We've got to recognise that this problem is not going to go away, and we have got to prepare much better and make decisions, take decisions. But it is really time for that big discussion and debate about how we're going to deal with the problem and the opportunities of migration in the coming years. Thanks.
Thank you, Grace. That's perfect. And last but not least, Niamh, over to you.
Thanks very much. So just on the first question of divisiveness, I personally think difference is good. I think difference of opinion is good. I think that's what the political system is about. I think we are seeing a move towards the extremes, but I have to say, I think that's a response to deepening inequality. And I think if you look at history, where you've periods of deepening inequality, you do have a move to the extremes. So I think the political system, political establishment has to take some responsibility for that. I suppose the question is, where are the limits to that? I mean, from my perspective, everybody who's here today has turned up to debate, to actually speak, to exchange ideas. We may have massive differences, but we're all here and we're speaking. Where I think that the kind of wheels are coming off the system at the moment is where you're looking at a system where people are just talking to people who agree with them, or they're shouting, or they're following somebody down the road who doesn't agree with them. Like at the end of the day, the purpose of for a political system to function, people do at some point have to engage with each other. And even if they protest, and I spent a lot of my career writing about protest, and protest is really important and really legitimate and can and should be obstructive in many ways. But I do think there are limits to that obstruction. And I do think there are points where we as a society would probably need to be more proactive about figuring out what those limits are when it comes in particular to endangering people, and when it comes in particular to endangering children, which we have seen in recent months in Ireland. And I think it's really important that everybody who is playing by the rules of the game, who is turning up and taking the trouble to actually exchange ideas, affirms that boundary, because that's really important. On the question of migration, obviously our understanding is when it comes to the Dáil, the Migration Pact will be it's actually 7 pieces of legislation, but we're only going to get one shot essentially at a vote. Personally, I think that's really unfortunate because it doesn't allow us to disaggregate out the different elements of it. The S&D supported this in Europe. I think there's a couple of reasons why. I think the first one is that given the scale of the challenge that migration is presenting to the European Union, and particularly the challenge which the displacement of Ukrainians presented to Europe, there is, and I think there will have to be, a more coordinated approach. That probably means some countries improving what they're doing and other countries supporting them to do that. But I personally feel that a more coordinated approach that recognizes that migration actually brings a lot of benefits to, I mean, if we look at the wheel as a sector, the community and voluntary sector is full of people who are new Irish or not, or don't consider themselves Irish at all, who are making a massive contribution to Irish society every single day, working extremely hard, often for very little reward. And it's really important in the migration debate that we recognise that. The second thing that for me, as somebody who's worked in the sector quite a bit, it shows is that you can have coordinated responses to migration that are positive and that are supportive. And I suppose that's really, I think, where the rubber needs to hit the road. You know, if we're going to shoot down elements of the Migration Pact because they could be potentially negative, we need alternatives, and we need to be clear about naming what those alternatives are, because we can't just sit in our hands and go, this is going to go away. And I mean, the biggest problem that we're facing at the moment was the failure of government to implement the results of the Catherine Day report. I mean, the things she said, which is that our whole system is reactive, it's short term, there's an information gap. Those 3 elements alone have created the mess that we are now facing. If we had moved to implement those when she had recommended them, we would not be facing anything like the scale of the mess we are facing today. So I think in knocking down elements that we have concerns about, we need to be really clear about what are the solutions, because the solutions are going to be central to this process. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Niamh. That's excellent. Okay, so we have a huge question next. We're actually going to combine about 3 questions. They're all around, I suppose, the just transition and environment and climate. So it makes sense to kind of group them all together for timekeeping purposes. So I'm going to try and represent them as best I can, and I'll just ask all the candidates to try and be as brief as possible, because we also have another couple of questions we'd really like to get to before we finish this afternoon. So I'll go ahead and kind of try and summarize these questions. One of the first one that I'll summarize is from Stephanie Brennan from the Aran Islands Energy Cooperative. So she notes that candidates have 80 inhabited Irish islands among their constituencies. Did they know that there are more than 20 million inhabitants on EU islands, making up the 6th biggest member state of the EU? And I suppose she notes then that the energy transition for islands is not a choice. Islands are resilient and can be lighthouse communities, but the EU policy needs to support them. She talks about the working together on policies around energy, mobility and environment. Not working in silos is very important. And then she notes some of the island issues. One is housing, which is separate island area housing plan or area plans. One is planning, keeping the population on islands, giving people the same priority as the environment. The environment itself then, installation of wastewater treatment plants, review special area conservation designations on islands, and then piers and infrastructure. So I suppose there's that kind of issue which is closely tied to environmental concerns. Susie Can from My Community talks about, could the panel give some specific examples of how we can address the challenge for communities in relation to state aid rules for just transition funding. So again, coming back to that theme of environment and climate and overall just transition, and how we can reduce barriers for communities to unplug EU funding for the furthest behind and not just organisations with high capacity. And then finally, we have one from Jenny Williams for Habitat for Humanity. The Social Climate Fund is the first EU fund specifically dedicated to providing financial support to vulnerable households in the context of climate change and energy poverty, integrating a social dimension into EU climate policies. Green policies are under pressure across Europe. What will the new EU administration, will the new EU administration water down green commitments? So there's a bit of a flutter of questions there. So around the islands, I suppose, around the just transition, and around integrating a social dimension into EU climate policies, and how under pressure green policies are across Europe. Will the new EU administration water down green commitments? So there's, and we see there's already a few questions. Like I said, I'm just going to ask you to try and be as brief as possible if you can, because we do want to try and get to 2 more questions as well, if at all possible. So Grace, you're actually first, so go for it. Oh, can I hear you? Hold on now till I check. I think you're still.
Yeah, that's me. Sorry, I just couldn't.
No
my finger was fumbling over the mute button. So a few things. And Emma, the reason I put up my hand first is, as I said earlier, I've got to head off
yes,
at
that's
12:30. And
yeah.
Anyway, all of these areas are areas of particular interest to me. So just to and thanks Stephanie, Susie, and Jenny for them. In terms of the well, firstly, when we came in 2019, I remember Billy Kelleher said to me when the Green Deal was launched and the flagship of this last mandate, Billy said to me, your job is done. The Green Deal is on the table. You can get off home for yourself now, you know. But actually, the reality is the Green Deal and the social transition and the fair, just transition is really under pressure. So what we saw was Ursula von der Leyen come in 2019, and she was going to be recognizing climate change and the biodiversity decline. And why I talk about biodiversity all the time is because if we don't have resilient, good habitats and ecosystems, we won't be able to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So in any case, what we saw just prior to the end of this mandate, so our last session in Strasbourg, was Ursula von der Leyen coming forward under pressure and saying, actually, we're going to roll back on the whole Green Deal, and we're going to move towards a grey deal. And I don't know if you're aware of that term, but that would be money will go into defence, security and defence. That obviously raised enormous alarm bells for me, because the whole transition will need time, and the whole revolution, as I would call it, in terms of clean energy, will also need time. So so this is what Antonio Guterres called he called this decade the crucial decade for humanity, for our very survival on this planet Earth. So for me, I've put 5 years into it, and that's why I'm coming back in. That's why I'm putting myself forward, because I believe that we need exactly the same energy and momentum and drive and absolute call it ambition to keep the Green Deal going. It's absolutely critical. Now, there were funding mechanisms put in place over the last few years, and that was in the cohesion funding we have the Just Transition mechanism. So there is money put aside. I mean, look, I could talk for hours on this. One thing I just can't say strongly enough: we have got to shift the momentum away from the grey deal and keep it on the Green Deal, because we're only starting to deliver. We're only getting the momentum going. We're only seeing, the ECB, the European Investment Bank, the European Central Bank, all of them said, just when von der Leyen gave the green light to the Green Deal, their investments moving in this way, towards this transition that's critically important for our survival on Earth. And now, just a few weeks ago, rowing back, and it is just totally unacceptable. So, that's why for me it's really important that we keep that the Green Deal on the table, and we keep it funded, and that there is a fair and that social, and we're all talking about that social Europe. I mean, like I said, the whole cornerstone of Europe is when we talk about prosperity, for me it's not about the prosperity of money, it's the prosperity of society, and that's what we have to keep going. And then just lastly, Stephanie, in terms of the islands around Ireland, the beautiful islands around Ireland and across Europe, I mean, an area I have worked very strongly in is working with island communities on the areas of fisheries, marine protected areas, the maritime spatial planning, maritime spatial progress, how we develop that space over time, from an energy, from a transport, from a social perspective. And I've worked with you probably know, and I just can't remember, Bonner up there in the island communities. So I would love to continue. I am a water baby. I love Ireland, and I will push the blue agenda as much as I can in terms of supporting rural and coastal communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace. I'm really glad we got that question before you had to go, and you did mention it in advance. So when you need to go, that's absolutely fine. But over to Lisa now.
Thanks, Emma. I'll keep it brief. Just, I suppose, in relation to the islands, I'm living on the west coast, so the islands I know best are the Aran Islands and Clare Island and Inishturk, and the communities there and the way of life is just so unique. And we can't just support those islands in terms of tourism for people coming to visit. We have to support the communities that are actually living there, and that the population can be maintained. When it comes to climate and dealing with the challenges there, sometimes I feel there's a little bit too much catastrophizing about it. Not enough hope given to people. I think we have to be, I suppose, realistic about how that issue is going to be dealt with. A few less cows and having a keep cup is not going to address climate change. It's the bigger ticket stuff, and that's why I've put a big push on advancing offshore renewable energy, offshore floating wind. I think there's huge opportunities along the west coast of Ireland. I think we can meet our country's energy needs with a green, sustainable source of energy. And we can actually export to Europe, such as the level of the wind corridor off the west coast. And Ireland can play its role in helping Europe transition to a greener, more sustainable economy as well. So I think we have to look to the opportunities that are there and give people hope, as opposed to just talking about the negative all of the time, because I think people just are going to start switching off and feeling as though they won't be able to address the issue when we absolutely can address the issue. And I believe that we will. And then in terms of the question around the next EU administration, that's a difficult question to answer because we don't know the makeup of the next parliament. There is a fear that it'll become, move slightly to the right. There are question marks over whether, say, for example, the migration pact could be delivered by the next parliament. That probably wouldn't have been if it hadn't have been passed in this parliament's term. So I think we just have to wait and see. But again, I'm a big believer in centrist politics. I think the centre has to hold, and I think that it will hold. And I think there's a silent majority of sensible middle ground politicians and citizens right across Europe that want to see us advance and pursue progressive policies and a progressive agenda in terms of the Parliament. So It's about being positive, it's about being pro-European, and it's about working together to address these, significant global challenges, and Ireland has to play its role as well.
Great, thank you very much, Lisa. Perfect. Over to Billy.
Yes, just on the islands themselves, I mean, I represent the constituency and I live in a county that has a few islands as well, Beara, Sherkin and Clare. But I think we pay a little bit of lip service to the regions in general, and more importantly to the peripheral regions, both at national level primarily, but also at European level. And I do believe, for example, in the areas of planning, we go toward the islands, we'll see summer, we'll see holiday homes. We don't see enough support for families who want to reside there, live there. The expansion of digital hubs is a critically important component of that, so people can work from home. And also just basic supports in terms of roads and infrastructure, which is something that is sadly lacking in connectivity. But I think one of the bigger failures still is the whole issue of broadband and capacity for internet capacity. That's one of the big problems I feel is causing difficulties. There is a scheme in place, so it shows that there's also, ambition in other areas. There is a European funded program for energy dependent by 2030, and that has been awarded to a number of islands in Ireland as well. So, we want to transition them to clean, renewable energy sources, but at the same time, if we want to sustain the populations, we have to invest in broadband, roads, piers, and allow for better application of planning so that families can reside there and work from home rather than where we're at the moment, maybe with holiday homes and people not residing there during the winter months. Just on the issue of the watering down reference to Grace, I know she's gone, so I'm not going to say anything that requires a rebuttal. But look, I think we probably sometimes say that just because we haven't made as much progress in certain areas, that the entirety of the Green Deal is being watered down. Elements of it have been, removed. Some of it, the ambition has been slowed, but certainly the Green Deal is on a march to implementation. And if you look across the entirety of all the sectors, in terms of the energy sector, the transport sector, the home building regulations, right across, there has been huge progress made, even in the areas of packaging and waste. So just to pick up on one or two areas of a sector and saying that because we haven't achieved the ambition that was set out at the start means that the entirety has failed, I believe is wrong to say that. So I honestly believe the Green Deal will be implemented and it will have a major impact in a positive way on the environment. Of course, in implementing that, we need to have a just transition. And that's where we have seen, weakness in terms of delivery on the ground. So if we transition in the area of energy, we want to ensure that we've just transitioned, so we've reskillings and investment in social capital so that people can transition. And equally, for example, in the areas of agriculture, well, we have to have supports in place so people can transition from the farming they're doing to the farming that is being laid out in new obligations under various directives. But that can only be done with supports, income supports. You can't just pass legislation and expect people to immediately be able to comply with it if there is a cost incurred and a loss of productivity and loss of incomes. So that's a key area.
Thank you very much.
Just reference was made to the state aid, and I'll say no more then.
Okay.
The state aid rules are there for good reason. We saw, for example, Germany gave 10 billion to Intel to develop a semiconductor plant in Magdeburg in Germany. 10 billion of German taxpayers' money went to attract. So if we go down the road of, unwinding state aid rules across the entirety, well, then we will very quickly end up with the biggest checkbooks, bringing all the industries and all the investment to their country. So we want to be very careful on that. But yes, in areas of social capital, and particularly in areas of the voluntary and community sector, there should be some flexibilities in that. But from an Irish perspective, that shouldn't cause us any difficulties because we have the resources ourselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Billy. Over to Niamh.
Thanks very much. So I'll just start on the islands issue. So my own background, my early career, I spent a lot of time doing research in Gaeltacht areas. So as the nature of that, I spent a lot of time on islands. I have to say that I actually think at that time, Europe had a big focus on minority languages and collaboration between different minority language communities around Europe, like so collaboration, say for instance, between people living in Inisheer and people living on the Faroe Islands. That whole agenda has died a lot in the last 10 to 15 years. And it seems to me that there's a lot of scope to bring back collaboration around island dwellers and island issues in Europe, to bring back that focus actually that was there in the 90s. It focused on language in the 90s, but that has been lost in the meantime, because a lot of island dwellers around the periphery of Europe are facing the same issues. And in many cases, it's the same solutions around infrastructure and tech in the first instance, but also around protecting their unique environments and protecting their unique cultures, not all of which are linked to language. So I actually think there's more scope to push the island agenda further in the next Parliament. On the just transition issue, I do think that the Green Deal is under pressure. I do think there is pushback. I think it's unfortunate that there is, but I do think there needs to be a questioning of how and why the pushback is coming. So there are some people who are just very hostile and don't believe in climate change, but there is also, I think, a broader level of pushback which requires, I think, some more thinking through. So for instance, if we look at the Just Transition Fund that has been established by the government, it has been extraordinarily slow in its movement, and the sense that how it will impact is very grey at the moment. I'm sure many of your members are aware of it. But the more important thing is there seems to be almost no mitigation for justice in climate change at the individual level. So I'll give you an example. At the beginning of May, the government introduced an increase in carbon taxes. That adds about €20 to the cost of a fill of home heating oil, 15 cents to a litre of petrol. They're significant, and they're particularly significant changes for people who are on fixed incomes, who are on low incomes. At the same time, the jet aviation industry, which is massively profitable and will experience massive activity in the next couple of months, pays no carbon taxes, even though kerosene fuel used in airline aviation is almost exactly the same as home heating oil. And that's a classic example how a big lobby group operating at both national and European level is able to exempt itself from a carbon tax, which, individuals, often very vulnerable individuals on low incomes, have to deal with. Consumption-based taxes are not always fair. We've seen in Ireland, for instance, that a lot of the strategies around climate, for instance, introducing solar panels or buying electric cars, it is the affluent, by and large, who have the ability to do that. The person who's living on a fixed income, who's living in social welfare and driving a 2006 car, is not in a position to have benefited from a lot of the things. So I do think in that pushback to the Green Deal, we need to look at the blind spot around justice in this transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niamh. Okay, so we have two more. It's Niamh Paul next, and then I'll ask you to be brief because there'll be one more question that would be great to get to before we finish up. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks indeed, Emma. So just in terms of the question, first of all, I think Stephanie makes a really good point in terms of highlighting all of the things that we really need more support for. And what I take from her message is that support really isn't there at the moment. And I agree with the last speaker. I think there was more of a focus on these communities 10 or 15 years ago than there is now. And I think that comes down again to fundamental political choices, whether we follow this path of a social Europe or whether we follow this path of a more free market centered Europe, a more militarized Europe. So I think that comes down again to my original point about political choices. The problem with just transition is that so far it's just not working very well. And the example of the Midlands, the former Borden Mona workers, is a really, really good example of that. If you speak to their unions, you speak to the union I'm a member of, SIPTU in particular, you'll hear there's huge disappointment in terms of how that fund was actually rolled out. That it didn't really reach a lot of the workers in terms of the reskilling that's needed. And I think we need to sort of look at that model and really look at it in terms of maybe insisting on a much greater application whereby we work with trade unions in particular and ensure that the money gets to the people that really need it. It's all very well to have ideas about small businesses and so on and so forth and tourism, and some of those are welcome, but they won't reach a lot of the workers that needed that fund and needed that reskilling. So we really need to focus on that, and focus in particular on making sure that there's a real commitment, not just in words, but in terms of financial contributions in just transition. My worry again is that if we see this further move to the right in the next Parliament, that won't happen. I think Billy has a point in relation to the state aid rules. I would argue for a fair and flexible system of state aid rules. We can't have a one-size-fits-all, because then we will have the bigger countries taking huge advantage. But we do need to see countries like Ireland standing up, and our MEPs standing up, arguing for fairness and flexibility so that we can do more. And I think, I visited the ports of Cork and also in Foynes this week, and they're hugely frustrated at this government's failure to actually push further on this issue. And we've got key offshore renewable projects that may not go ahead as things stand. So that's a key issue. Finally, I just want to come back to Billy. I was a little bit disappointed. I get on well with you, Billy, as you know. But when you use that phrase, you don't want them here in the first place. I'm personally disappointed to hear you say that, Billy. As vice chairperson of the Migration Committee of the Council of Europe, I went over to Greece and challenged the Minister for Migration in Greece in relation to his government's negligence and the mass drownings of people trying to reach Europe. In contrast, Billy, and I have to just be honest here, when there was a key vote in the European Parliament to take action against mass drownings, you didn't turn up. So please don't give me lectures in relation to that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Over to Cian.
Yeah, thanks a million. Okay, so look, forgive me if I'm a bit harsh. I think this is just bleak. So I'm 34. I think I was born when I was 5 years old. There was the first COP, and they said that, oh, now we're going to take climate change seriously. Every year since, the amount of CO2 emissions globally has grown. Every year for the last 5 years. There was a brief dip because of COVID, but in general, like the actual, despite all the talk, despite everything that people say, the actual problem, not only are we not addressing it, it's actually getting worse. Do you know what I mean? The actual climate destruction taking place is growing year on year, despite all the talk. And like, it's just a level of unreality that we can sit here and say, well, we all agree that we're going, and like actually out there, what is actually happening is things are getting worse. And that's, it just breaks my mind. So the only way we can understand that is that there are deep vested interests that benefit, that profit from the destruction of our planet, and that those deep vested interests have a key corporate control of the European Union institutions and the Irish institutions. And we need to break that control. We need to end the for-profit oil and energy sector. We need to make that a not-for-profit and use those vast resources to have a rapid transition to renewable energy. We also need to break the control of big agribusiness. We have members of the European Parliament who are themselves shareholders in big agribusiness, themselves big dairy farmers. We need to challenge that, and we need to be instead of big agribusiness and pollutive, as was said, we need to be moving towards more renewable, more sustainable agricultural practices, more biodiversity, more food sovereignty, not just for environmental reasons, but also for food stability for our own island. But if we are to really do that, it does mean system change. And that means having like a bold approach, because I feel that the approach that's been taken so far by the, which I welcome, like the Green New Deal, the positive steps, that is all welcome. But the problem is that what people are seeing is that the only bits of just transition, the only bits of climate action that they're seeing really impacting them, or the ones that they're really feeling, are the things like the carbon taxes and stuff like that are hitting people in their pocket, whilst the biggest business polluters are getting away with it. So just a small example of like, so in Limerick, we have Irish Cement that have gotten permission to burn tyres in their cement factory. In Cork, their Indevar are trying to get permission for a new incinerator. And that has been overturned. And just a small example of the corporate capture, I think the High Court has ruled that the planning permission given the Indevar in Cork is not valid because one of the planning officials was a former Indevar worker. But the head of the Environmental Protection Agency in this country is a former Indevar worker. So the level of corporate capture of our environmental agencies is a problem, and that's what we need. We need to see a significant change on that if we're to really tackle. So I am very alarmed by the shift against climate. I'm an eco-socialist. That's my day job, as I edit a eco-socialist magazine. But the way that we have to really address this is by saying that actually no, this is if we're to really address this, we have to take on the big business powers that are to blame and show that climate action is good for our living standards. It's things like free, fast and frequent public transport. It's things like retrofitting every house in the country rapidly to bring heating bills down, but also to bring emissions down. And that's where I think things like the state aid rules are a relevant thing. That we need not just, I'm not talking about giving huge more subsidies to companies to attract them, but the state should and be investing directly, a state construction company, for instance, in retrofitting homes, directly employing people to do that. That could be seen as state aid, as skewing the market, because it's a state construction company with state funding and not a fair competition. But I think that's the kind of things we need to be doing if we're to actually tackle these things rapidly and show that climate action means a better quality of life for people. It means a shorter 4-day week without loss in pay to bring emissions down. It means positive actions and showing that it's not just an excuse to tack on extra taxes onto ordinary people. So I am alarmed by those things. I do think that the state aid stuff is relevant. In terms of the final thing, I'd like to talk more to, I think it was Stephen was asking about the islands thing. I'm not certain if I'd agree. I don't know, you were asking about special areas of conservation of the islands and maybe rebalancing that. Look, I understand that there's a tension there. People want to build, people need to live on these places, and we need to get that and do that. But I'm not sure if the way around that, and maybe I'm totally misreading your question, but I'm concerned about if part of about the way around that being to reduce the protection for special area conservation. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but if that is, I don't think I'd agree with that. I'd like to talk more and find out more workable solutions that can protect the planet and protect the nature while also making these livable and vibrant communities. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Cian. Right, we have one more question. It would be great if we could get to it, but I'll have to ask candidates to be, 2 minutes or less kind of responses, please. So this one, we're just grouped it broadly in supporting the sector. So there's 2 questions within this. Number 1 would be, how would you handle the anti-NGO narratives within parties and in public debate? And the second one is from Felicity Maxwell, Irish Architecture Foundation. It's how would the candidate support artists and arts organisations which often challenge the status quo and contribute to mental well-being and community? So broadly, you can see the theme of supporting the sector, the work we do, that kind of thing. So does anybody want to stick up their hand and promise to be as brief as possible? It would be great. So Lisa, you're first, over to you.
Grant, thanks. I'll be very quick. Anti-NGO narrative. I think the question that comes up a lot of the time is around transparency and openness. So I just think we should never be afraid to be honest about, how we work, how things are funded. And I do think it's reasonable for people to ask questions about the spending of public money. And we have to be in a position to answer that. So, I think the way we deal with that is by being open, honest, transparent, and answering people's questions around where the money goes and to whom and how it's used. Because it's people's money at the end of the day. And then in terms of supporting artist organisations and artists, I couldn't agree more. That's why we have I suppose under Catherine Martin's department, the minimum income for artists to try and kind of support that sector. I know it's not for everybody and doesn't work for everybody, but I think the initiative there is very, very good. I think supporting local arts centres in different communities is a really good way to use money, because a small bit of money goes a very long way.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and very, very succinct. Billy, you're next.
Yeah, just the 2 issues there. One in terms of the artists themselves. Firstly, the Arts Council and certainly direct income support for artists. We know it's a very challenging occupation at the best time. It gives us a lot of joy and it brings a vibrancy and an excitement to society. So it's something that should be supported beyond what the market can provide in terms of wages and salaries. So there is a minimum wage for artists. I'd like to see further supports in arts councils, but also in community arts centres, things like that, whereby people would have a critical mass around artistic endeavour. On the issue of NGOs, look, there's no point in us saying it otherwise. NGOs provide a wonderful support base for people. They're advocacy groups. They develop policy. I very often have adopted policies from NGOs when I was a spokesperson for the party on various policies. So, they provide a very valuable link between society and the hard-nosed areas of government. And I just think that they should be supported. And I wouldn't like to see an undermining of NGOs, but as referenced by Lisa, openness and transparency in terms of public funding is clearly critically important. I just want to say to Paul Gavin, I wasn't referring to Paul that he was anti-immigrant, but the change in the Sinn Féin policy was the one I was referring to. And I certainly know that Paul has done an awful lot of work on that particular issue. So to be clear, it wasn't directed at Paul, it was directed at the change in policy from Sinn Féin around the issue of open borders. I accept Paul's bona fides as an individual, but the change in policy was the one I was referring to.
Okay, thank you, Billy. Paul, it's over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So just on the 2 points, first of all, yes, I mean, local arts centres and artist community needs to be supported in a much better way. They form a key part of our local communities. And I think, to be fair, I think there'd be a consensus, I would have thought, across all of us in relation to doing that and championing that at an EU level in terms of funding. The NGO issue is a really important one. I'm really pleased that it's been asked. And look, all I want to do is call out the fact that we need to say who it is who's attacking the NGO sector. And look, they're not here to see that at the moment, but it's the EPP group in particular. And indeed, some of the independent candidates, in inverted commas, have also gone after the NGO sector. And I think it's a really cynical type of approach. Of course, you need transparency, but let me be clear, the NGOs I've worked with have done excellent work and have been a real aid both to opposition and to government. And I think we need to be clear on that. Finally, in terms of Billy's remark, I accept what you've said, Billy, except the key point you make, which is there hasn't actually been a change in Sinn Féin policy. And that's what we've been consistent on saying right the way back since 2020. Thanks again, Emma, and thanks for all of your colleagues tuning in and for their really good questions.
Great, thank you very much. Niamh or Cian, would you like to come in on that question? No. Okay, great. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Cian, you did. Sorry.
Yeah. Just very briefly. On both. Well, in terms of the arts, this is something I'd like to. I'm not 100% sure as to the role of the EU in a lot of this stuff. I'm sure there is some funding that comes from it, but I think my knowledge of this is that a vast majority of this is national through the Arts Council, and then some of it is through local councils as well. What should I say? I agree. The minimum income for artists kind of policy is currently a pilot scheme. I'd like to see that rolled out more generally. I think that is something we need to be like valuing art. That art and artists are doing, even if it's communal work, it's productive work. And one small example there that I'm aware of is that there is in a lot of development funds, like this is at council level, I'm aware from my time as a councillor, but developers provide an amount. There's meant to be a % for art. But a huge amount of the time, as in like whenever there's a big development taking place, the developers are meant to present a certain percentage for some art development as part of it. But a lot of the time, that % for art never gets spent. It never actually turns into actual art as part of those developments. That's like a small pet peeve of mine from my time at the council. I'm not aware. I haven't heard anybody else here say as to the specific EU angles there, but it would be something that I would push for. And in general, I am very excited to see the development of things like Praxis, an artists union, and I work with others to try to like bring artists together as a voice. I think artists, there's a tendency to see artists as individuals competing against each other because you're all fighting for the same applications, but actually artists coming together collectively and organizing, I think, is useful. And it's something that in Limerick there was a lot of around the City of Culture stuff when artists started to get organized and find their voice. And I think that's something we need to see more of, but on the NGOs thing, look, this is alarming. And I don't know, people maybe saw that there was the runner of one of the homeless charities is being threatened now because they were given, like, they're getting death threats from the far right because they're giving out tents. This is how bleak things are getting, and we do need to be standing up to it. I was involved in organising the Big Ireland for All March last year, which saw a huge amount of community, voluntary groups, political groups, trade unions coming together, and I think we need to see more of that. The other thing that I'd say is there can be an attempt, like I maybe this will be controversial with some, but I think there is an attempt sometimes by government politicians to like hide behind NGOs, to like the extreme of it is to say that, oh, it's not us that's responsible, it's them, and they sort of end up putting the NGOs in the firing line. because it gives them a little bit insulation from their policies, from what they're doing. And they're the ones that then get shot or shooting the messenger for the problems that were actually created further up the line. So I think that's part of it. I think we need to build a movement that push these people back, and B, we need to address the root cause of the problems that are causing people to be very angry, that NGOs are getting the blame for what are actually societal-wide problems, and we need to be addressing those societal-wide problems as well. But it is alarming.
Thank you very much, Cian. Niamh, over to you.
Yeah, I'll just come in there finally, just to add to what everyone has said on arts and arts organisations. One of the big issues in the arts organisations that I work with and are familiar with is space, and artists being squeezed out of space. I think there is, I know certainly the S&Ds have anti-speculation policies in terms of housing very much on their agenda for the next Parliament. I think there is scope for the EU to help protect the space. Certainly in Limerick, a lot of visual arts people are under pressure in terms of space. On the second piece, on the anti-NGO narrative, and again, somebody who's worked with this sector for a long time, there's unfortunate elements of it, but to be honest, part of it is actually a symbol of success. Like a lot of the NGOs I have worked with, part of your job is to advocate for the very vulnerable people that you're working with who don't have the capacity to advocate for themselves. And when we see this kind of pushback, even though it's terrible and in some cases it can be frightening, some of it is actually a symptom of the fact that the kind of work that NGOs doing is actually landing. And they are advocating and supporting these really vulnerable people. So what I would say to people in the sector is please continue and don't be afraid. I think a lot of work has been done on the transparency and governance stuff. And for me, the critical issue is that you don't actually squash the life out of NGOs by putting massive governance demands on them, which hoover up all their resources. But I think really some of the pushback is actually a symptom of success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niamh. That's okay. We're out of time for questions, I think. So I do want to share a little bit about our pledge and where people can find out more in a moment. But I don't know, Colette, do you want to come in for while I get my slide lined up with any kind of closing remarks? I think you're on mute still.
We're only doing this since 2020. I still haven't got the hang of it yet. So yes, just to finish up by thanking our candidates, by thanking Paul and Niamh, Billy, Cian, Lisa and Grace, who unfortunately had to leave slightly early. We really do deeply appreciate all of your time, and thank you for sharing your plans for working with our sector should you be elected, and for responding so comprehensively to all of the questions that were asked there. I'd also like to thank all of our participants for joining us today, and again for sharing all of your questions and your thoughts, and really obviously adds to everything that we're doing. So hopefully Emma has her slides up, and I'll hand you back to Emma just to talk a little bit more about the pledge.
Yeah, so just very quickly, yeah, we do have, if you want to find out anything more about our EU elections campaign, which is #FutureIsCommunity, you can go to wheel.ie/EU elections and read all about it there. Colette outlined some of our big priorities anyway at the beginning of today's session, but you can read more about it on that. You can read also about other kind of tools and useful information for charities and community groups coming up to the elections, how they can get involved. So just kind of urging everybody, all the candidates, to engage and to share their support for it, and for all of the organisations here today to do the same, to share it and to ask their candidates to support this pledge. But that's it. We will, of course, include everything, including the recording and links to the pledge and everything in the follow-up for today's session, as well as a link to our previous Hustings event if you would like to listen back to that, and we'll be sharing that far and wide along with this one. But that's it from us today. Thank you very much again to everybody that Colette said thank you to, the candidates and our participants today. And yeah, don't forget to vote. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Cheers. Have a good day.